A humble beginning, extended and unique. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the tiny apartment, creeping through the thin curtains that barely covered the cracked window. A soft golden glow painted the peeling walls, giving the modest space a warmth it did not physically possess. The air was thick with the comforting scent of cinnamon and oats, the only breakfast Samuel and his mother could afford most mornings. Standing on his tiptoes, Samuel carefully stirred a pot of oatmeal on their single-burner stove. The wooden spoon felt too big in his small hands, but he had mastered the morning routine. His mother, Maria, sat at the worn kitchen table, absent-mindedly rubbing her temples. The exhaustion of working double shifts at the local diner was written all over her face, but she still offered Samuel a tired smile as she watched him. "You're such a good helper, Sam," she murmured, reaching over to tousle his unruly brown curls. Samuel beamed. "I added extra cinnamon today, just like you like it." His mother chuckled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "You're always thinking of others," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He shrugged. "That's what you taught me, right?" They sat at their tiny kitchen table, their chipped bowls resting on an old tablecloth full of stitched-up patches. Samuel noticed his mother rubbing her hands together, a nervous habit she had whenever she was worried. He knew she was thinking about the bills stacked on the counter, the landlord's recent threats, and the little money left in her wallet. "I know things aren't easy right now," Maria finally said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "But we have each other, and that's what matters." Samuel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I like our home," he said softly, not wanting her to feel guilty. "And guess what? After school, I'm going to the park with Daniel and Luis." His mother forced a smile, though her chest ached. She hated that she worked so much, leaving Samuel to navigate the world alone. But what choice did she have? "That's great, sweetheart. Just be careful, okay? And don't come home too late." "I won't, I promise." After breakfast, Samuel slipped on his sneakers, scuffed and a size too small, and grabbed his tattered backpack. As he stepped out of their small apartment, the scent of warm tortillas and sizzling onions from their neighbor's unit filled the hallway. The building was old, with cracked walls and creaky floors. The stairwell smelled of mildew, and the flickering overhead light buzzed like an angry insect. But Samuel didn't mind. It was home. As he descended the stairs, Mrs. Gonzalez, their elderly neighbor, peeked out from her door, holding a plate of empanadas. "Samuel, Mijo, come here." He trotted over, inhaling the delicious aroma. "Good morning, Mrs. G." She pressed the warm plate into his hands. "For your mama. She works too hard." Samuel grinned. "Thank you. She's gonna love these." Mrs. Gonzalez patted his cheek. "You're a good boy, Samuel. Your mama raised you right." With a final wave, Samuel continued on his way, his heart swelling with appreciation. His neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was full of people who looked out for each other. As he stepped onto the busy city streets, the world around him buzzed with energy. Car horns blared, street vendors called out their daily specials, and a group of kids raced past him on bicycles. The sidewalks were crowded with people heading to work, some in business suits, others in uniforms like his mother's. Samuel didn't mind the walk to school. It gave him time to dream. He dreamed of a day when his mother wouldn't have to work so hard. A day when they wouldn't have to count pennies at the grocery store or worry about rent. He dreamed of becoming someone important, not for fame or money, but to take care of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when he reached school. The day passed quickly, filled with the usual math problems, spelling tests, and lunchroom chatter. But Samuel was counting the minutes until he could go to the park. As soon as the final bell rang, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and rushed outside, where his two best friends, Daniel and Luis, were already waiting for him. You ready? Daniel asked, bouncing a soccer ball against his knee. Samuel grinned. Let's go. The three boys raced toward the park, their laughter echoing down the city streets. The park was a sprawling green oasis in the middle of the concrete jungle, full of towering trees, winding paths, and a shimmering pond where ducks lazily floated. Samuel loved this place. It was one of the few spots in the city where he felt free. They spent the afternoon kicking the soccer ball around, dodging between trees and benches, their shouts of excitement filling the air. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they finally collapsed onto the grass, exhausted but happy. I wish we could stay here forever, Louis said, stretching his arms behind his head. Yeah, Samuel agreed, gazing up at the sky. The clouds moved lazily, shifting into shapes that sparked his imagination. But then, something caught his attention. A little girl, no older than 6, was playing near the pond, her tiny hands outstretched as she chased a butterfly. She wore a pink dress and white sneakers, her golden curls bouncing as she laughed. Samuel frowned. Something about the way she was running, so close to the water's edge, made him uneasy. And then it happened. A shriek tore through the air. The girl had tripped. For a split second, she hung in the air, her eyes wide with shock. Then, splash! The pond swallowed her whole. The world seemed to freeze. Samuel's heart pounded. People turned, gasping, but no one moved. The water was deep, and the little girl flailed desperately, her small arms barely keeping her afloat. Without thinking, Samuel jumped to his feet. Samuel, wait! Daniel shouted. But Samuel was already sprinting. Time slowed. The girl's head bobbed beneath the surface. Samuel's pulse roared in his ears. And then, he dived in, the daring rescue. The world around Samuel disappeared the moment his feet left the ground. 1 second, he was on the grassy bank, his heart hammering in his chest. The next, he was plunging into the cold, murky water of the pond. A sharp chill bit through his thin clothes as he kicked forward, his arms pushing against the resistance of the water. The pond was deeper than it looked, and the little girl was already sinking, her tiny hands barely visible beneath the rippling surface. Samuel could hear muffled screams behind him, the distant, panicked voices of people at the park, but they didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the terrified child disappearing before his eyes. With a final thrust, he reached her. Her arms flailed wildly, her small fingers clawing at the water as she fought to stay above. Samuel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, but she panicked, thrashing in his grasp. "Shoo, I got you," he gasped, his breath shaky as he struggled to stay afloat. The girl coughed and sputtered, her eyes wide with terror. She clung to him with a strength that surprised him, her tiny hands gripping his shirt like a lifeline. But the weight of their soaked clothes and her panicked movements made it harder for him to swim. His muscles burned as he kicked furiously, pushing toward the surface. Above the water, the shouts grew louder. "Somebody help them," a woman screamed. Samuel gasped for air as he broke the surface, the little girl in his arms. The pond felt bigger than ever, the shore impossibly far. His arms trembled as he struggled to keep both their heads above water. He turned toward the shore, his vision blurred by the water dripping into his eyes. A man in a sharp suit was standing at the edge of the pond, his face stricken with fear. Several parkgoers were gathered around, pointing and shouting. But no one was jumping in. Samuel grit his teeth. He couldn't wait for help. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his grip around the girl's waist and started swimming. His arms screamed in protest, but he forced them to keep moving, dragging both of them toward safety. The girl buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing, her tiny body trembling. "You're okay," Samuel whispered between gasps. "Just hold on." Stroke after stroke, he pushed forward. His lungs ached, his legs burned, but he kept going. The shore was getting closer. Just a little more. A few feet away from land, strong hands suddenly grabbed Samuel by the arms, yanking him and the girl out of the water. The moment his feet hit the ground, his knees buckled. He gasped for breath, his entire body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The little girl was lifted from his arms and wrapped in a warm blanket. Samuel collapsed onto his hands and knees, coughing violently, water dripping from his hair and clothes. The world spun for a moment before he felt a firm hand on his back. "Are you okay, son?" He turned his head and found himself staring into the face of the man in the suit, the one who had been standing at the edge of the pond. He had piercing blue eyes, slicked back dark hair, and a sharp jawline. His expensive watch gleamed in the sunlight, and his designer shoes were now soaked from stepping into the shallow end of the pond. More importantly, his face was lined with sheer panic. Samuel blinked, still trying to catch his breath. She fell in, he managed to say between coughs. The man turned sharply and knelt beside the little girl, who was wrapped in a thick coat, shaking. "Emily." "Oh, my God, sweetheart, are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. The girl sniffled, her tiny hands clutching the blanket. "Daddy," she whimpered. The man exhaled sharply, pulling her into a fierce hug, his hands trembling as he held her against his chest. Samuel suddenly realized who he was. Nathaniel Carter. The billionaire businessman. His face was everywhere, on billboards, in newspapers, on television. He owned some of the biggest companies in the country. He was one of the richest men in the world. And his daughter had almost drowned. For a moment, Nathaniel held Emily tightly, whispering reassurances into her ear. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze and locked eyes with Samuel. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how small he was compared to the man towering over him. Then, to his surprise, Nathaniel Carter stepped forward. And dropped to one knee. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Samuel swallowed. I just did what anyone would do." Nathaniel shook his head. "No. No one else jumped in. But you did." He paused, glancing down at Samuel's soaked clothes, the scuffed sneakers on his feet, the faded patches on his shorts. His gaze softened. "What's your name, son?" "Samuel. Samuel Ortiz." Nathaniel nodded, then turned to the crowd. "Someone get this boy a towel." A woman rushed forward, draping a large, warm towel around Samuel's shoulders. The softness of it was foreign to him, it smelled like fabric softener, like money. Nathaniel turned back to him. "Samuel, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Samuel's heart pounded. He knew what was coming. Nathaniel Carter was a billionaire. He could give him anything. Money. A house. A new life. He could change everything with a single check. But before the man could make an offer, Samuel blurted out the one thing no one expected. "I don't want money." The crowd gasped. Nathaniel's eyes widened. "What?" Samuel bit his lip. His hands tightened around the towel. "I don't want money," he repeated. Nathaniel looked confused. "Then, what do you want?" Silence stretched between them. Samuel took a deep breath. Then, with steady eyes, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Give my mom a job." Nathaniel's breath hitched. The crowd went silent. Even Emily, still wrapped in her blanket, lifted her head to stare at him. For a long moment, Nathaniel Carter didn't speak. His expression was unreadable, his sharp features unreadable. Then, suddenly, he turned away, rubbing his eyes. Samuel watched, confused. Was he crying? Nathaniel Carter, billionaire tycoon, was crying? Finally, the man exhaled deeply and turned back, his eyes red-rimmed but full of something else, respect. "Tell me about your mother," he said softly. And just like that, everything changed. A plea that shook a billionaire. Nathaniel Carter's piercing blue eyes bored into Samuel's as he absorbed the young boy's words. Around them, the gathered crowd stood in stunned silence. No one had expected this. A child who had just risked his life to save a billionaire's daughter had been offered a reward beyond his wildest dreams. He could have asked for riches, a mansion, a life of comfort. But instead, he had asked for a job. Not for himself. For his mother. Nathaniel ran a hand through his wet hair, his sharp features shifting between astonishment and something deeper, something raw. Samuel's hands clenched the towel wrapped around his shoulders, his heart pounding. He had spoken without thinking. But now, with Nathaniel Carter staring at him so intently, doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake? Had he asked for too much? Would this man even care? Nathaniel exhaled, his breath shaky. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he asked, "Tell me about your mother." Samuel swallowed, glancing at the crowd around them. Strangers were watching. Some with curiosity, others with admiration. But this wasn't about them. Taking a deep breath, Samuel steadied himself and spoke. "My mom, she's the hardest working person I know," he began, his voice small but steady. "She wakes up before the sun and comes home late at night. She works double shifts whenever she can, and even then, it's barely enough." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting Samuel continue. "She used to have a good job," Samuel explained, his fingers gripping the towel tighter. "She worked in an office. She was proud of it. But then the company cut jobs. She lost hers. After that, no one would hire her because she didn't have a fancy degree." Samuel's throat tightened, but he forced himself to go on. "Now she works as a cleaner in a restaurant. They don't pay her enough. They don't treat her well. And she never complains. She just keeps working, because she has to." His voice wavered. "Because she has me." The weight of his own words settled heavily in his chest. Nathaniel Carter remained silent, his gaze darkening with an emotion Samuel couldn't place. Finally, he spoke. "And your father?" Samuel's chest ached. He shook his head. "I never met him." A few gasps whispered through the crowd. Nathaniel's expression flickered. There was something in his eyes, something far away, as if he was remembering something painful. But he quickly masked it, his face unreadable again. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the distant chatter of parkgoers, the occasional car passing by, and the wind rustling through the trees. Then Nathaniel turned to his daughter. Emily had been clutching her blanket tightly, watching the exchange in silence. Now, she looked up at her father, her big blue eyes still red from crying. "Daddy," she whispered. "Can we help him?" The billionaire seemed to freeze. It was such a simple question. Yet, coming from his daughter, after everything that had just happened, it carried the weight of something much bigger. Nathaniel slowly turned back to Samuel. For the first time since the boy had pulled Emily from the water, the billionaire truly looked at him. Not just as a kid in tattered clothes. Not just as the boy who had saved his daughter's life. But as someone real. As someone who mattered. And then, something in Nathaniel's expression softened. He let out a slow breath. "What's your mother's name?" Samuel's heart leaped with hope. "Maria Ortiz." Nathaniel nodded as if making a decision. "And where does she work now?" "The Blue Orchid Diner," Samuel answered quickly. "She cleans tables, washes dishes. She'll be there now." Nathaniel turned to one of the men standing behind him, an older gentleman in a tailored suit, who looked like he might be Nathaniel's assistant. "Find her," Nathaniel said. The man nodded instantly, pulling out his phone and stepping away. Samuel blinked, his breath catching. Was this real? Was this actually happening? Nathaniel turned back to Samuel, his expression unreadable. "I don't believe in coincidences, Samuel," he said slowly. "You didn't just save my daughter today. You changed something." Samuel barely heard him. His head was spinning. His mother, they were really going to find his mother? His heart raced as he imagined her in her faded uniform, scrubbing plates in the back of the diner, exhausted but determined. Would she even believe him when he told her what had happened? Would she believe that a billionaire was coming to see her? The thought made his chest tighten. And then, something else occurred to him. His mother had been let down before. So many times. What if this was just another empty promise? What if Nathaniel Carter changed his mind? Before he could stop himself, Samuel straightened his shoulders and met the billionaire's gaze. "You really mean it?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "You'll help her?" Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, to Samuel's shock, the billionaire crouched down to his level. And held out his hand. "I give you my word." Samuel hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out. And shook the billionaire's hand. The moment their hands met, Samuel felt something shift. Not just in the air. Not just in the way the crowd watched in stunned silence. But in his life. Everything was about to change. The meeting that changed everything. The weight of Nathaniel Carter's promise settled over Samuel like a warm blanket, filling him with something unfamiliar, hope. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "What if he doesn't keep his word?" Samuel had seen it happen before. People with power, with money, saying nice things, making promises, only to forget the moment they walked away. But something about the billionaire's eyes, sharp yet softened, told Samuel that this time might be different. The assistant, the sharply dressed man who had taken Nathaniel's command, had already disappeared into the crowd, his phone pressed to his ear. He was efficient, moving with the confidence of someone who got things done. Samuel clutched the towel around his shoulders, barely feeling the damp fabric anymore. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, where she was, what she was doing at that very moment. Would she even believe him? Would she be angry that he'd asked for help? He swallowed hard. His mother was proud. She never begged. Never asked for favors. What if she refused? The thought made his stomach twist. Emily's small fingers tugged at his sleeve, breaking him from his thoughts. "You're really brave," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from crying. Samuel blinked at her, surprised. "I'm not that brave." Emily shook her head fiercely. "Yes, you are. You saved me." Samuel glanced at Nathaniel, unsure of what to say. The billionaire was watching him carefully, as if trying to piece something together. Before Samuel could respond, the assistant returned, his face unreadable. "I found her," he said. "She's still at the diner." Samuel's heart thudded. Nathaniel nodded. "Then let's go." The billionaire turned to one of his drivers, a tall man in a dark suit who had been standing nearby, silent and alert. "Bring the car around." The driver nodded and hurried away. Samuel's breath caught. They were actually going to see his mother. A part of him had expected Nathaniel to change his mind, to wave off the promise as something said in the heat of the moment. But here he was, making things happen without hesitation. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to believe that this might be real. The drive to the diner. The black luxury car pulled up to the curb, its polished surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. Samuel hesitated at the door. He had never been in a car this fancy before. Nathaniel, noticing his hesitation, gestured for him to get in. "Come on, kid. Time to see your mom." With one last glance at the crowded park, where people still whispered about what had happened, Samuel climbed in. The car smelled like leather and something expensive he couldn't name. Emily sat beside him, her small hands folded in her lap. Nathaniel sat across from them, watching Samuel with quiet curiosity. As they pulled away from the park, Samuel glanced out the window, his fingers gripping the seatbelt. He knew every crack in the sidewalks, every rundown building they passed. This was his world. And now, for the first time, someone from the other side, the world of wealth and power, was stepping into it. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Nathaniel broke the silence. "You're a smart kid, Samuel." Samuel looked up. "I guess." Nathaniel tilted his head. "No, you are. Most kids in your position wouldn't have asked for what you did." Samuel swallowed. "I don't care about money. I just want my mom to be okay." Nathaniel studied him, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, quietly, he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." Samuel frowned. "Who?" Nathaniel didn't answer. He only looked out the window, lost in thought. Samuel wanted to ask more, but before he could, the car slowed. They had arrived. A mother's tears. The Blue Orchid Diner was old, with a faded blue awning and a flickering sign. The windows were streaked from years of city grime, and inside, Samuel could see the usual scene, waitresses rushing between tables, the cook flipping burgers behind the counter, and the steady hum of tired customers sipping their coffee. And there, in the back, hunched over a sink full of dishes, was his mother. Maria Ortiz. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, was stained from a long day's work. She scrubbed furiously, her hands raw from hours in the hot, soapy water. Samuel felt a lump rise in his throat. She looked so tired. Nathaniel followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped out of the car. Samuel hesitated, then hurried after him. The moment they stepped inside, a few heads turned. The sight of a billionaire in a three-piece suit standing in a rundown diner was not something people saw every day. But Maria was too busy scrubbing to notice. Samuel's heart pounded. "Mom," he called, his voice almost lost in the noise of the diner. She didn't hear him. He tried again. "Mom." She froze. Slowly, she turned. Her tired eyes widened in shock. "Samuel?" Then she saw Nathaniel. Her hands tightened around the dish she was holding. Confusion, and then something like fear, flashed across her face. Samuel took a shaky breath. "Mom, it's okay." She looked at him, searching his face. "What's going on?" Before Samuel could answer, Nathaniel stepped forward. "Mrs. Ortiz," he said smoothly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Nathaniel Carter." She stiffened. She knew who he was. Everyone did. Her grip on the dish tightened. "What?" Nathaniel held up a hand. "Your son saved my daughter's life today." Silence. Maria's lips parted. Her gaze darted to Samuel, and when she saw the damp towel still draped over his shoulders, her breath hitched. She started, but no words came. Samuel looked up at her, his heart pounding. "I asked him to help you, Mom," he said softly. "I told him you deserve better." Maria's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. She turned away, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth. Nathaniel let her have a moment before he spoke again. "I want to offer you a job," he said. Maria froze. Slowly, she turned back to face him. "What?" Nathaniel met her gaze evenly. I run a lot of businesses, Mrs. Ortiz. And I need people who work hard. People who don't give up. He glanced at Samuel. People like your son. Maria blinked rapidly, her breath shaky. I have an opening in my corporate offices, Nathaniel continued. It's not charity. You'd have to work for it. But I can promise you this, you'll be paid fairly. You'll be treated with respect. And you'll never have to scrub another dish if you don't want to. A stunned silence stretched between them. Maria's hands trembled. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but this time, they weren't just from exhaustion. They were from hope. Real, tangible hope. Samuel watched her, his own eyes stinging. He had dreamed of this moment. But he had never thought it would actually happen. Nathaniel extended his hand. What do you say? Maria stared at it. At the hand of a billionaire. At the future it offered. And then, with a deep, shaky breath, she took it. A new beginning or a price to pay. Maria Ortiz's hand trembled in Nathaniel Carter's grip. His handshake was firm, steady, almost grounding, but Maria felt like she was floating, untethered. This couldn't be real. The man standing before her was Nathaniel Carter, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. His name was in newspapers, on billboards, on the news. Men like him didn't walk into places like the Blue Orchid Diner. And they certainly didn't offer jobs to women like her. Her first instinct was doubt. What was the catch? No one gave anything for free. Not in this world. She pulled her hand back, pressing it against her chest as she steadied her breath. I don't understand, she whispered. Samuel was still looking up at her, his small hands balled into fists at his sides, waiting, hoping, that she'd accept. Nathaniel studied her, his sharp gaze catching every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. I know this is unexpected, he said, his voice measured, careful. But it's real. Maria swallowed hard. She had spent years being invisible. Years scrubbing dishes, waiting tables, working late nights for barely enough to survive. She had given everything to ensure Samuel had a roof over his head, food on the table, and clothes on his back. And now, after all those years of struggle, she was being offered a way out. Maria's hands clenched. Why would you do this? Nathaniel exhaled, as if he had been expecting that question. Because your son didn't ask for money, he said simply. Maria turned to Samuel, her heart aching. She had taught him to be humble, to never expect handouts, to work hard and be proud of what they had, even if it wasn't much. And yet, here he was, braver than she had ever been. Not for himself. For her. Tears burned her eyes. Samuel, Mijo, she whispered, brushing his wet hair back. Why did you? Samuel cut her off, shaking his head fiercely. Because you deserve it, Mom. His voice cracked on the last word. And Maria broke. She fell to her knees, pulling him into a tight embrace. For so long, she had believed that her suffering was necessary. That it was the only way. But now, because of her son's courage, a door was being opened. One she had never dared to believe existed. The weight of a decision. Nathaniel gave them a moment before clearing his throat. There's a car outside, he said. Let's talk somewhere quieter. Maria hesitated. She could feel the stares of the other waitresses, the cooks, the customers. The whispers. What was she supposed to say? She had been working in this diner for years, scraping by, barely making ends meet. This place had been her prison and her survival. Now, someone was offering her a way out. She looked around one last time. The faded blue walls. The chipped tables. The greasy smell of fried food that clung to her clothes. The life she had accepted. Her gaze landed on Samuel again, her reason for everything, and she finally made her decision. She untied her apron, set it on the counter, and walked out with her son. The offer on the table. Back inside the luxury car, Maria sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. Samuel sat beside her, his small frame practically sinking into the plush leather seat. He had never been in a car this nice before, and the way he gently ran his fingers over the seats made her chest ache. He deserved so much more than she could ever give him. Nathaniel sat across from them, watching carefully. His assistant, the sharply dressed man, had a folder in his lap, flipping through some papers. "I won't waste your time, Mrs. Ortiz," Nathaniel said. "I want to offer you a position in my company." Maria frowned. "But she hesitated. "I don't have a degree. I've never worked in an office before." Nathaniel waved it off. "You don't need a degree to have a strong work ethic. My company needs someone reliable, someone who's not afraid to work hard. Samuel told me about you." Maria's breath caught. "He did?" Nathaniel nodded. "He told me how you work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. How you never complain, how you come home exhausted but still find the energy to help him with schoolwork." Maria swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. "I don't believe in just hiring the people with the best resumes," Nathaniel continued. "I believe in hiring the right people. And I think you're one of them." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a full-time job. A salary that will let you move to a safer neighborhood. Health benefits. Stability." Maria's breath hitched. She had dreamed of this. But it always felt impossible. She gripped her hands together. "And what would I be doing?" Nathaniel glanced at his assistant, who handed over the folder. "Office administration," he said. "It's an entry-level position, but there's room for growth. You'll get training, and I'll personally make sure you have everything you need to succeed." Maria hesitated. She had spent years cleaning corporate offices. She had walked through the hallways of power, but only as a ghost, someone no one looked at twice. Now, she was being asked to step inside. Not as a cleaner, but as a part of it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's face shifted slightly. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, something personal. "Because someone once did the same for me," he admitted quietly. Maria tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel exhaled, glancing down for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "I wasn't always rich," he admitted. "I grew up in a place like yours. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. One day, someone took a chance on her. Gave her an opportunity that changed our lives forever." He leaned back, his eyes dark with memory. "I never forgot that." Silence filled the car. Maria felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just charity. Nathaniel Carter understood. And because of that, she finally allowed herself to believe. Maria took a deep breath. And then, she nodded. "I'll take the job." Nathaniel's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. Samuel let out a whoop of excitement, hugging his mother tightly. For the first time in years, Maria laughed. A real, full-bodied laugh, one that wasn't weighed down by exhaustion or fear. For the first time in forever, she felt light. A future rewritten. As the car drove off, taking them toward a new life, Maria looked out the window, watching the city blur past. She had spent years thinking that this was all life had to offer. But her son, her brave, selfless, wonderful son, had shattered that belief. Because of him, doors were opening. Because of him, she was choosing a new path. She reached over, squeezing Samuel's hand. He smiled up at her, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. And for the first time, Maria let herself believe in it too.